And coming back on shortly. Have been having a lot of technical troubles. I'm hoping that now we're back to normal and we have everything normal again. So hopefully, here's Amanda, and this time we are recording and we are live. I can see it live now, so we are definitely. I'm not sure. To be honest, I'm not sure if we are live. It's certainly recording at least. If we're not recording, if we're not live, we'll do the video and we'll send it out as soon as I can. But let's bring Amanda back on again. Here we are. Okay. Sorry about this. I've honestly, last time I had some trouble with Janie and I had trouble with audio only, but it all worked. And with some work from some help that I have to fix the video stuff, we got it sorted out. This is even worse, and I don't know why it's so bad. So please apologize. Please accept my apologies for this again. But hopefully we're live and hopefully it's all recording and things should be okay this time. So Amanda, what we might do is we might just go back a little bit and just readdress that whole question of what you do for businesses and so on. Is that okay if we do that? You're silent. Why are you silent? I can't hear you. Is your audio on? You can hear me, okay, I presume. But why can't I hear you now? Oh, awesome. We got so many problems. Oh, now you've gone. Okay, so she's gone again. Hopefully we'll be back in just a minute and we'll get the stream working again. Right, here comes Amanda. Are you there?
Yes, sorry, I had an unresponsive screen, so I just realised I was just going to have to shut it down and start again.
It's like a comedy of errors, mostly on my side here, and I've got quite a lot of equipment here to make things work, and it just doesn't work, and I don't know what to do. Anyway, so if we can go back to the start a bit, and let's just try and get this for anyone's joining again. They'll have just joined. We'll have a video. So, what is it that you're doing? You're better, faster, happier. We just talked a little bit about that and what that means for companies, and talking about how they mostly come to you for faster is the biggest issue, right? And as opposed to better, as opposed to happier, rather. Happier is more a way you deliver the result. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think faster is the trigger point. I think particularly because I tend to work with quite early stage companies. So you know what it's like. You have a startup, there's 20, 30, 40 people or whatever. It's very easy to coordinate. It's easy to align. Everyone knows what everyone else is doing. The process overhead is very low. But obviously, as these companies start to expand, they get more funding, they grow, suddenly it gets much harder to maintain that speed that they had early on. And obviously that speed has been a part of their success, being able to get things out the door quickly, being able to test and whatever. And they want to be able to maintain that as they get bigger. So that kind of speed of execution, operational excellence type piece, it tends to be the trigger for people reaching out to me. I mean, once you're in the company, you discover a myriad of things going wrong, but in terms specifically of speed, because I think being nimble at scale is quite a big challenge, and one of the things we said we talk about today. And I normally find that there's three common themes around that, three common contributors. So the first one is focus. So essentially, a lot of the companies I work with are just trying to do too many things simultaneously. And when you start root causing why that is, you go, okay, the prioritization tends to be quite poor. Okay, why is our prioritization poor? It tends to be because the strategy is not clear enough. And I know you and I have had, lots of conversations about strategy in the past. And I think one of the things you should go through, I think, as part of coming up with your strategy is making some tough decisions and some trade-offs. Here are some things we are not going to do. And I think quite a lot of the time that doesn't actually happen. A lot of the companies I work with, we're doing everything. And how that plays out in reality is you've got this long list of initiatives or, hundreds of OKRs.
Yeah.
And you're spreading your teams very, very thin. So what you're doing is making very slow progress on a whole raft of initiatives instead of making substantial progress on 2 or 3 really critical things. And that is a very, very common trend that I see all the time, just trying to do too many things simultaneously.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a common theme with my clients as well. I have one client who they started out with 16 company OKRs and it just didn't work very well. And after some effort, we got them to narrow this down to 6. and they couldn't narrow it down any further than 6. They just couldn't manage to make decisions about this. They went through the quarter, and through the quarter, because they were now focused on a smaller number of them, still too many, but 6. They were able to. They figured out that they were actually delivering about 3 of them, and they didn't make much progress on the other 3. So at the end of the quarter, we did a retrospective and looked at what did you actually do and what did you not, and what made a difference. And they realized that they only really made progress on the 3 of them, and the next time they managed to get their actual conscious focus down to 3. Because what happens if you don't make that conscious decision is that either you're making very little progress on anything, or in their case, at least they made successful progress on 3 things, and that was a better result than not much progress on 6 things. But the decision about how to do that was kind of made in an ad hoc way, or almost in a way of like, we start doing things, and then these ones seem to be easy, so we do more of those things, right? And it's a common theme amongst all my clients. I have one client who, at the moment, I'm working with, who once they're trying to do they're trying to do a whole bunch of stuff, but they don't really know who they are. So they don't know whether they're competing on price or on quality, on features, or on ease of use, or what they're competing on. So they're trying to do a bit of everything, which then means that they'll be a bit average at everything, right? And even if they succeed in moving the needle on all 6 things that they're looking at, they'll be a bit average on all of them. And the same with another one. I mean, we have the same problem with another one. They've just got too much commitments on the board, so everything's going really slowly, and they can't make progress on the things that really matter. So the only solution to this is to decide, well, how do we reduce the number of commitments we have? Otherwise, what do we do? So I mean, that sounds like the same sets of problems that we both encounter quite frequently.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a very similar set of problems. And I think it's quite interesting from conversations we've had in the past, because obviously you do a lot of work with companies introducing OKRs. And
Yeah.
obviously OKRs are a way to translate your strategy into actionable, measurable goals. But one of the things I know you've experienced is that if the strategy isn't clear, it's really hard to get to OKRs. And I think a lot of companies are really keen to adopt OKRs, but one of the reasons they struggle is, that's kind of the second part. You've got to have your strategy first.
Well, funny enough, I was actually having a conversation yesterday with some people on this exact topic about OKRs and strategy and how it works, and that same thought came up. And I agree entirely that not having a strategy means it's really hard to do OKRs. It's really hard to do anything, to be honest. But specifically OKRs, it's quite hard. However, what I have also found is that almost without fail, every single company I work with, they think that they have a strategy, and they think it's very clear. And that, because the CEO or whoever's done this, or the founder, has put together a 65-page PowerPoint deck, and there's this beautiful deck with all of the strategy in there, and it's really clear. And when we presented it to the all hands, nobody asked any questions. Therefore, it's all clear to everybody. And we ask people, is it clear? And they say, yes, it's clear. Turns out they just don't want to have a 65-page presentation again, so they don't want to ask any questions about it. But what really goes on here is that if you try and set the OKRs, you discover that they can't decide on what the most important objectives are. And if your strategy is not clear, then of course you can't decide what your objectives are, because once your strategy is clear, it's quite obvious what your objectives should be, and how how to measure them is a problem to solve. But you can do that relatively easily if you know what you're really trying to do and how to do it. So I find that sometimes I go through this process. In fact, not sometimes, pretty much every time with companies, we go through a process of setting OKRs, and then they struggle to set them, and that's when they realize that their strategy is not clear enough. And it doesn't matter as an outside person if I look at this and I think that the strategy is not clear enough, because then they'll give me the 65-page presentation, after which we're now in the same situation, and I can't convince them that they have a problem until they experience the pain. So I actually use OKRs as a method to help people understand when not consciously to do this. That's not my goal, but it happens on a very reliable basis, that by doing this, we discover that we have some ambiguity in our strategy, and now we've got to do something different. But yeah, that's my set of tools. That's what I'm doing. You're doing some different things. What is it that you do for alignment? Like, when you have this lack of focus, how do you help solve that problem in an organization, or where do you start?
I mean, for me, the piece around alignment is really about creating independence. So, historically, companies have tended to organize by function. That's sort of been the default system that came out of the Industrial Revolution. That's the norm. But when you look at it, it actually doesn't make a huge amount of sense, because you're really organizing people by what they do rather than by what you want them to achieve. And for a lot of people, this idea of cross-functional working is a little bit foreign and a little bit scary. And the analogy that I normally use is with football. So if you go out and buy 3 football teams and you go, right, I've just bought these teams, first thing I'm obviously going to do is to, reorganize and restructure. So you put all your, your goalkeepers and defenders in one team, you put all your midfielders in another team, you put all your forwards in the third team. You have just organised by function. And when you explain it like that, you start to realise it actually doesn't make an awful lot of sense, because none of those three teams is going to be particularly successful, because actually in order for a team to win games, it needs a mixture of those different experiences. And that's really all you're doing with cross-functional teams, is you're aligning people around goals. So in fact, not necessarily the OKRs, but certainly that strategy and those kind of, fairly long-lived outcomes are really important before you figure out before you can start aligning people. Because in order to align people, you need to understand, well, what is it we're trying to achieve? Once you understand what we're trying to achieve, then you can start thinking, okay, what are the different skills and experiences that we're going to need in order to be able to achieve this goal? Because the key thing you're trying to do is to create independent teams. You are actively trying to reduce dependencies, because when you reduce dependencies, you reduce your coordination and your process overhead. So instead of spending a lot of time in meetings, or putting a lot of budget towards project management, or whatever your particular approach is, you've actually got independent teams. They have a goal, they have all the skills they need to achieve that goal, and that's what's liberating them to move at speed. So going back to that nimble at scale, it's creating these small independent units. Spotify actually sum it up. Well, when they were sort of first tackling this, the question they were asking themselves is, how do we stay small as we get big? And that would, they obviously came up with their own solution. I think Amazon, went down the lines of initially pizza teams and then single-threaded leadership. So, lots of different organizations have sort of pursued this concept. But yeah, I mean, it's, I don't think it's the only way to do it. There are obviously companies that use OKRs as an alignment tool, but I like the cross-functional working, partly because I think it keeps it quite simple, but also because of the benefits you get around collaboration and particularly innovation, because you create this melting pot of different skills and experience, and it gets rid of the silos and ultimately accelerates what you do.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like this whole I was at Amazon for a couple of years, and the two pizza team was what they called it, which made a lot of sense. Except that because the idea, by the way, for people who don't know, is that you should have a team that's cross-functional, and it should not be bigger than what you can feed with two pizzas. Now, what I found really amusing about this is that when you translate that into Europe, that's two people, because pizzas are quite small in Europe, and they're usually a one-person meal as opposed to a family meal like is in the US. So what they're meaning here is a large, like a family size, Pizza Hut sort of pizza, like those fast food thick ones. And then each pizza might serve 3 to 5 people, maybe 6 people. So you can have a team of up to sort of 8 to 12 people or so as a two pizza team. But anyway, that's sort of a side issue there. But on the topic of the football teams, that's a fantastic analogy. I love it. I'm going to crib that one. I'm not generally a sports person, but I really like that analogy. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about that is that in order to have any of those teams achieving things, you need to be very clear about what they're trying to achieve, right? And so you've got this clarity about what they're trying to achieve, but you need the mixture of skills in there, and that combination really makes a difference. So, we talked about OKRs briefly, but if you put an OKR on a functional team, a bunch of forwards can't achieve anything meaningful because they need the rest of the team to be able to do that. Whereas if you have a cross-functional team, you can really achieve something meaningful there. But you're more about sort of like helping organize those teams into those cross-functional groups and helping them communicate, helping them get. Do they need to have a common manager, or is this more just a cross-functional team and you have functional managers and that's okay?
So I think it works fine with functional managers, but I do think it's quite important that you have a leader. So one of the things I look at in terms of, okay, it's one thing to put people in a cross-functional team, but how do they then operate together effectively? Because it's going to be new for most people, right? You've actually got to kind of design what that process looks like. And you've just talked about, that idea of OKR. So first of all, you want your team to have a single purpose, and then you want a single process that's going to support that single purpose. So what does that look like end to end? Who's doing what? Who needs to be involved when? And I think the roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities are a really important part of that. The whole concept of a racy in the agile world is like, that's not agile. But actually, it's just quite practical, because it creates clarity and structure for people, because otherwise you can have this system where everyone's responsible, so no one's responsible, and nothing ever gets done, or things fall between the gaps. So I definitely think that having a designated cross-functional lead is important. That person that's ultimately responsible for what the team is going to achieve,
Yeah,
what
yeah. I mean,
is going to
is that
achieve.
someone? Sorry, is that someone do you often consider that person to be the product manager, or is this like a business manager, a business leader, or?
I think it depends a lot on the context, because by default you don't have to have engineering or product within a cross-functional team. Very often it makes sense to. So it could be the product manager, or it can actually be a sort of product manager and a business partner, sort of have a shared accountability, which sounds dodgy, but actually what tends to happen is you've got a single goal. The product manager will be accountable for one sub metric, and the business manager will be accountable for the other sub metric, but they are both laddering up to that
Yeah.
single outcome. So I think the most important thing is that you have a leader with leadership skills, somebody that's got ownership, initiative, is proactive,
Mm.
can plan, but also that is very good. Because what you don't want is dictators. You don't want someone coming in and just, saying, right, I've got a bunch of people here, I'll just tell them all
Yeah.
what to do. You want somebody that's actually going to foster collaboration and go, actually, I've got this incredible bunch of skilled people. How do I get
Mm.
the most out of those skills?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's like, I mean, often a lot of the times that I come across, especially agile people, but also especially even more so Scrum people, but a lot of software developers as well. And this is a common theme at Google. In when I joined Google in 2006, was that we don't need managers. We're self-organizing teams. Therefore we don't need leadership. And then I've come across some, I went to a uh, Coach the Coaches session with Marty Kagan, the guy who wrote, which is this book here, Empowered and Inspired, sort of the product manager Bible, if you like, and the product manager leadership Bible. But went to this session with him, and one of his whole theories is that empowered teams don't need less management; they need better management, and you need to be a very capable leader to be able to lead an empowered team. If you're going to have a disempowered team, you're going to micromanage. You don't need to be that capable to micromanage, but you're going to suffer by losing your team and not getting stuff done. Whereas if you can empower the team and be a capable manager as well, a very good leader, then you can get those results from that. And in some sense, we just mentioned about should that be a product leader or not. I guess that depends on whether you're building a product or not. That would be the obvious answer to that in some ways, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on what is it the team is actually trying to achieve. What's their goal? Because that could be a building a digital product, but it could be some kind of marketing goal. It could be a trading goal.
Yeah.
Obviously depends enormously on your business. But I think, making sure that you have a designated leader and that the roles and responsibilities are clear, but also that everybody else understands how they contribute. I mean, I talk a lot about accountabilities versus responsibilities. So, the squad leader might be ultimately, I'm using this term squad, call it cross-functional team. The cross-functional team leader is ultimately accountable for value. Everyone else is responsible for it, though. So you don't get to go, well, if we don't hit the outcome, that's your problem because you're the leader. No.
Yeah.
And you can actually use those accountabilities and responsibilities not just to look after value. You can look after, you make sure that the quality or usability or whatever else you need to think about. So you might, within the cross-functional team, you might have someone completely different that is ultimately accountable for quality, but likewise they are still responsible for value. And your squad lead, it might be accountable for value, but they are still responsible for quality. And I think that way you actually create a sense of shared ownership, because ultimately the cross-functional team is going to be successful by achieving all of these things. And that's where kind of that roles and responsibilities piece, the responsibilities and accountabilities piece, I think is really, really critical. And the whole, oh well, people will just self-organize. I think the agile world is in there because the agile world really wants to promote this idea of autonomy and self-organization, which I'm massively in favor of. But I think we're at a risk of making it sound very straightforward and very simple. And I think actually getting to the point of self-organization, there's a lot of maturity there. And I think you need to think carefully about how you get to that point. I don't think it's as simple as we sometimes make it sound.
Yeah, and that's where I think people often try and solve that with a Scrum Scrum Master type thing. But in some sense, I think that the actual solution that really depends on really good leadership and coaching of people, and how do you build the team? How do you select people in the team? How do you get the wrong people off the team, and all that sort of stuff? And it's very hard to do that as a Scrum Master because you're not empowered to actually do that. So you actually need someone who has those skills, who is a leader, who has the responsibility to deliver the business results, and then who has the who's empowered to actually make those decisions. Otherwise, they don't happen. And I think that to me, that's a very big thing, a very important thing about having leaders in the place, that you empower them. In fact, a lot of the people that I talk to, I work mostly with exec teams, but a lot of the time, what I'm doing to them, just like we empower teams, we're actually empowering the exec team to make decisions, because a lot of the time we end up in these consensus-driven environments where we can't make decisions, and we can't. We delegate. We believe that we should be empowering the teams and having them make decisions. But in order to do so, you need to make the decisions around what the scope is, what they're doing, and get the decisions on how these teams work together, and then they can figure out, then they can self-manage, and then they can align and all do all of that themselves within their teams if they're capable.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that, you make that point about leadership, because I think, if you look at some of the really big successful companies out there, the Amazons and the Googles and the Netflixes and so on, they all work in different ways. They all have their own way of doing things, but seems to me there's a couple of very common trends, one of which is leadership. Invest in really, really good leadership. And you made a point about a Scrum Master. I think a lot of companies do go down the route of, let's have armies of agile coaches and Scrum Masters. That's what's going to make us more agile. The likes of Amazon and Netflix and so on, they didn't go down that route. They invested in really good leaders instead. And I think really good leaders, and also hiring really good people, I think that's the other thing that stands out to me, is that those companies firstly have a really good idea of the characteristics of the people they need in order to fit that autonomous culture. So they're hiring for those high levels of ownership and accountability. They actually go after that, which is one of the things that enables them to work in this much more autonomous system. Whereas less mature companies, they might really believe in the whole autonomy, self-organization piece, but they've not necessarily hired for that. So you're then trying to impose this quite sophisticated system on a team that doesn't necessarily yet have the maturity to get there.
I love that you say yet, and I think some of that yet part is all about having leadership who can actually do the coaching, and sometimes getting in external coaches. But the best coach is always most of these situations for a team is often the leaders, like they're people who are there because they're bought into the result. So you have an investment in actually getting the result. But you mentioned you talked about alignment a bit, and I find it interesting because I was at both Amazon and Google for a couple of years, and they have a really different approach to alignment. And which is interesting. So, I mean, just briefly, Google tends to centralize, make decisions centrally, and then cause people to be aligned through this almost ironically, command and control kind of mentality, but then empower people within that. Amazon's a little bit more decentralized and tends to have lots of decisions happening at the lower levels or mid levels of the organization, empower those people. And then later on, they discover or they figure out or they decide to solve the parts where there's misalignment. And so that solving part ends up being quite difficult at Amazon compared to Google. Like at Google, it's all aligned to start off with. Amazon, you have to fight to get that alignment and so on. But alignment is a big thing for growing companies. Because when you go from having 10 people, you're all aligned because you're in the same room, you're trying to do the same thing. You're often in that search discovery phase. 50 people, it's getting harder, but now we've got like some different ideas. We've got some different leaders in the room. You can usually at least have a conversation, one-on-one conversations with all the leaders, get all the leaders in the room, and you're fine. As you get beyond there, my goodness, it gets more and more complicated, and there's so many people to get aligned. And what is it that you start to do to align people? Like, do you deal with that particular problem, that to help people get aligned?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it gets harder the bigger the company gets, and I think that's when that's the cross-functional piece or single-threaded leadership, or whatever concept you're using starts to be helpful. So there's a company that I'm working with at the moment. They've got different brands, so the company is a group of different brands. So you've obviously got at the group level, you've got a leadership team, but then there's also the capacity to go, okay, well, we can treat the brands as smaller units, and we can have a brand leadership team. Then within the brand, we can have these smaller units, whether you call them tribes or cabals or whatever it is. But again, they're mini units. And then within, let's call it a tribe for the sake of the argument, within the tribe, you can then have these smaller units. And essentially, each one has like its own mini exec team. So even at the level of a team, we talked about product manager as a potential leader earlier on. The product manager might be the, the CEO of the team, if you like. And then, as you go up, you've got more and more of those. And then I think what you can start to do is look at how does information flow down and then back up again. So looking at things like, your planning cadence and your planning horizon. So, if you're C-suite, you're not necessarily thinking about this year. You might be thinking about 3 to 5 years, whereas if you're at the brand level, maybe you're thinking about, the next 1 to 2 years. And that, the sort of cadence gets shorter as you go down. And once you get to a team level where you're actually executing, then, maybe you're just working quarterly, but figuring out what that cadence looks like and making sure that leadership teams are far enough ahead that they can be providing that direction so people can start planning ahead. And then the other thing is, in terms of sort of tracking the progress, I know this is something you talk a lot about with OKRs, but having what I call check-ins. So those regular sessions where teams and leadership are getting together, so teams can play back, here's what we're trying to achieve, here's what we've done in the last 2 weeks, a month, whatever it is, here's what we've learned, here's what we're going to do next. And by the way, here's any help or guidance that we need. And then you've got that coaching session where leadership can sort of start to challenge the thinking, question the decision making, gives them visibility, helps them build trust, also gives them an opportunity to intervene if there's any potential disasters, and hopefully through that coaching upskill the team as well. So you can kind of have these channels, so you can have that kind of check-in model happening again at all of those different altitudes. So that's worked for me so far, but I haven't got to the point of working with an Amazon or Google sized company yet. So
with them, the whole concept of like the C-suite is often looking 3 years in advance. Funny enough, in my experience with companies, they're often not, and that's one of the challenges that they have, is that they're too finding the current fires too much. Well, not necessarily too much, but that's like what is dominating their thinking at the moment is today's fires. And so getting the time, carving out the time at the executive level to have the executive team thinking, even 2 quarters in advance or 3 years in advance. I mean, that does happen, but it's fairly limited. I remember Jeff Bezos talking about he spends his time 3 to 5 years out, and that's everything. And then if something comes up that's now, that means something has gone wrong in his organization, right? If he has to spend attention on something now, then something went wrong. And so that's the problem he's trying to solve, is how do I make sure that my team can do all of the stuff that's now, and in fact all the stuff that's next year and the year after, so that I can spend things on 3 years and onwards. And that transitioning from that sort of like working on the now to working on the future is a really tough thing for a lot of leaders. And I think a lot of the things you're talking about, this whole focus, alignment, and autonomy are the things that enable that, right? It gets you there, but it's very hard to make those changes.
Totally, and I think that's one, because we've obviously talked about focus and alignment, and for me, the autonomy is the third element of that. And that's partly because if you don't start devolving autonomy, leadership become bottlenecks, and as soon as you've got bottlenecks, you slow down. So it's in terms of scaling, it is a non-negotiable. Yeah. But likewise, that a lot of that is quite scary for leadership. And the way that I try and sell it to people is that you are getting out of the weeds of today so that you can start thinking about tomorrow. Because if you're not thinking about tomorrow, no one else is going to be. So it's not about, we're not taking control away from you. It's nothing like that. There's still going to be those mechanisms, those feedback loops. You're still involved in goal setting, you're reviewing what's happening on a week-to-week basis or whatever, but you're devolving responsibility for today's execution. So you can look at the future. I think it's a way for leaders to scale themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is one of those things that is really like those 3 things really complement each other, because without the focus and without the alignment, you can't have autonomy. Because when you have autonomy and you're not focused and not aligned, people go in different directions. And you can go back to that whole football team idea there. If you have especially if you have a team full of forwards doing, all trying to do the same, do something that isn't. They're not focused on really getting the same goal. They're just focused on their own skill set and then trying to get a goal with that skill set. It's very hard. But if you don't have the autonomy, if you don't have the focus on what you're actually trying to achieve, people will go in different directions. If you don't have alignment, they go in different directions as well, and it'll be the wrong goal or whatever. And you've got three teams there. You're trying to get goals at the same time. You need to have them all trying to achieve the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And it's kind of, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that idea of aligned autonomy is really important. Autonomy is not free for all. It's autonomy within a set of constraints. And, one of those constraints is going to be, an OKR or a goal or an outcome or whatever. You're not free to just go and do whatever the hell you want, but you are free to achieve this goal in whatever way you want. Because you're right. Otherwise, if you don't have the alignment, you have autonomy and anarchy at the same time.
It's funny. It's like in the creative industries, people talk about constraints as being the constraint is the thing that drives the creativity or gets you the right result. If you have design a car, right, you can kind of do anything, which then means, especially if you have a team of people, you'll end up with a sort of a weird mixture of cars, and it won't be in a particular direction. But if you have to design a car to meet a particular market need, like, we want to design a family car that's going to be less than this many meters long and cost less than that much, or have these, serve this particular market, this kind of interest, and be able to carry a set of golf clubs or whatever it is you're doing, and have this much, fuel economy or whatever else it is, right? You've got these constraints there, and that can help you come up with a really good solution to that. And funny enough, in business, we often think of constraints as being negatives, and like we have to destroy the constraints or break the constraints. And in some ways, I think that's true. In some ways, finding ways of breaking certain constraints is really helpful. But generally, for most teams, most parts of the organization, you need some constraints. You need the right constraints. You need to break the wrong ones, but you need to have the right constraints so that you have, here's the problem I'm trying to solve, and here's what I'm trying to achieve here. And so once you have that, you can then be constrained with your alignment, and you have to work with another team. You're constrained about what goal you're trying to get, what resources you have, and then your autonomy fits into that. And that means you can be autonomous, and with that autonomy, you can come up with great solutions.
Yeah, and that point about constraints is so interesting, because again, I think it's one of those things that needs quite a lot of maturity. I've certainly noticed with the organizations I've worked with, when they're introducing OKRs, that if an OKR is really challenging, that sort of gives people the sense that they're being set up to fail, rather than recognizing that actually, by making it challenging, it's encouraging you to go, well, if the company was to go bust if we didn't achieve this OKR, and you were going to lose your job, what would you do to try and achieve this OKR? Yeah. But again, I think it takes quite a lot of maturity to start to recognize that. I mean, is that something you talk to your clients about, the level of stretch you put in OKRs?
Yeah, the stretch is an interesting thing, like just general ambition. And I find that there's a natural assumption of of not meeting any particular goal, whatever it is, not meeting any goal is really bad. And I think that it's not always the case, because when you set a goal, the purpose of setting the goal is not to predict your outcome. I mean, that can be helpful, but it's not the goal. It's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to get the best performance. And sometimes, I often tell a story about, I did a cycle ride from Paris to London about 3 years ago, with just a 3-day, 320 kilometers or 200 miles, with a group of 60 people, which for raising money for charity, or 70 people, or whatever it was, to raise money for charity. My goal, and I cycle a bit, but I'm not the world's fittest man, but I've never done anything of that scale. I'd ridden 80 kilometers in one day, but never 2 days running. And here I was about to do 100 plus kilometers for 3 days running. And I thought, well, okay, what's my goal for this? And my goal was to get to the end of it and still walk, and not need a lift, really, was the goal. And it turned out that when I started to ride, I was actually able to keep up with most people, and I wasn't way behind. And I was worried that I'd be the one person panting behind everyone else, bringing up the rear, and having the van come along and say, come on, do you want to lift? All that sort of stuff. But no, I was in the middle of the pack. So I sort of reset my goal to be okay, I'm going to have a new goal. And there wasn't a race or anything like that, but my goal was basically to keep up with the middle of the pack. There was a bunch of racers out the front, and there was some slower people, but if I could keep up, it was fine. And that get me going, and I really enjoyed the ride, and I was able to have good conversations with some of those really interesting people who are sort of better riders than I am, but I was able to ride with them and have great conversations. It was a really wonderful experience. And at the same time, came a day, I think it was on the the second day or maybe the third day, where there were two incidents on both those days where I was like, okay, I can't do this anymore. I have to go slow. So I just slowed down, and it was fine. And having that goal sort of got me going and gave me inspiration. And then I was able to fall back to my previous goal, and it was okay. But that's kind of a long-winded and slightly irrelevant story where I get to talk about bicycles. But in some ways that's also the case with business. You want to get to your some sort of goal, and sometimes just having a goal that's like really ambitious can drive you to new solutions and so on. And you might not necessarily reach the moonshot, right? But at least you land amongst the stars, which is a slightly broken analogy. But you land somewhere good because you're aiming for that, and that landing somewhere good is important. But then you need to have frees people up from that is having leadership managers who are assessing performance not based on the prediction of the goal, but based on the actual performance and the actual constraints and what actually happened, and whether that was good or not. And so once you have people involved enough in that, and this is where you have to have active, good leadership, good management, you can actually assess that, and it's okay. But that's
Yeah,
not for
and
me.
that point about having the psychological safety as well, I think it was really. I mean, I'm sure lots of people watching will have come across this, but when Google did that research around team effectiveness, that they found that actually the number one predictor of team effectiveness was psychological safety. Obviously, there are other things involved as well, but yeah, knowing, giving people the space to aim high and fall short, and that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. That'll make sense. Hey, look, we're coming up to, I think, 10:02, which is about when we said we'd finish up because we've got other commitments as well. And I'm sure other people watching do too. Before we go, I guess I've got two questions for you before we go. One is, do you have any tips? If you were to say, here's the one thing that I want people to leave with as a piece of advice that they can apply in their own business life when they're working with their organization and they're seeing some of these nimble at scale problems, what would you suggest them to do is the first question. And I know I'm putting you on the spot with this because we didn't prepare anything on that, but I like to put people on the spot sometimes.
I think if you're one kind of fun thing you can do for yourselves, if you find that you're struggling and you're wondering what's going wrong, look at the different objectives you're trying to achieve and map out what are the different skills that you need to achieve those, and you will quite often end up with something that looks like a bowl of spaghetti. That's a good way of just visualizing. You'll start to understand for yourself where some of your problems might lie. Um, or that's one way to go about it. The other thing is just a root cause. Just start asking yourself, why is this happening? Okay, and why is that happening? And why is that happening? That's a really simple way to start recognizing some of what's going wrong, I think. And at least once you recognize the problem, then you can start doing something about solving it.
Yeah, and I guess, and the second question is that when you come into a new company, when it's your first, there's some sort of problem that you've been given, you've spoken to the management, they've said, yes, Amanda, we'd love you to work on this problem. We've got an engagement. You start working. What do you do to get things started? I mean, obviously, if people are interested in working with you, I've put your LinkedIn on the screen. They can contact you. That's fine. But what do they expect? What should they expect? Or what do you do to make sure that you, as an external who doesn't know anything about the business, can solve these problems or can help them solve these problems?
Yeah, so I have a fairly kind of simple, high-level methodology. So the first thing I do is what we call discovery in the product world. So the first thing that I'm trying to do is figure out what are the problems and also why are they happening. So depending on the organizational size, I will spend a certain amount of time just talking to lots and lots of people to get a really good idea about how do things work now, what works, what doesn't work, and why doesn't it work. And then off the back of that, I will basically develop a strategy of here's how I think we can tackle these problems. I will play that back to the organization, understand their priorities, get their feedback, and then at that point we can sort of co-create a bit of a change plan, decide who's going to be involved, and actually start to make it happen. Because for me, the delivery element, the execution element, has to be a collaboration. You can't just bring someone in from outside and have them sprinkle fairy dust around. You work hand in hand with them to actually change. So yeah, that's kind of my preferred way of going about it, because I think if you've really understood the problems and the outcomes and what success looks like, you're in a much better place to actually help organizations.
Yeah, that's true. Certainly, that's what I find. Partially, that's about like understanding things, and it's also about just getting that connection with the people who need to actually do the work and change. And as external people, we sort of you have to do that discovery, and you have to use that as a chance to sort of like understand where people are coming from. Because if you can't understand where they're coming from, you can't help them change, and what their problems that they're really experiencing is. Look, Amanda, it's been a pleasure as always. It's lovely to talk to you again. We will, if anyone's on, if anyone has any further questions or anything you'd like to ask, drop Amanda or me a line. If you're watching this on the recording, still feel free to stick a comment in the comments below, whether it's on here or on LinkedIn or YouTube, wherever you are, and we will get back to you at some stage somehow. And if you're watching this live and you had that whole experience we had at the start with the things breaking and then starting again, and you've joined again, great to have you back. Thank you for making the effort. All right. Well, thanks very much, Amanda. And you'll stay online and we'll have a brief chat afterwards. But thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye bye.